To be totally honest, we still have way more questions than answers, but that's what Talkin' Tuesday is all about on the podcast daily. And to be honest with you, we also don't know when we might be talking and asking questions to Ryan Day in Ohio State, but it'll be soon. And hypothetically, we can just act like it's going to be today, because that's Bill Landis and I'm Austin Ward. And the questions are going to be the same, whether it's today, tomorrow, Sunday. It's got to be one of those. Well, it's not going to be today, but it could be tomorrow.
December 14th. Yeah, that's
and it might be Sunday. But no matter what, the questions are going to be asked about what the heck happened on Saturday. That's going to continue for a while. What other questions haven't we asked yet, Bill, that are still plaguing your mind as we are 3 days now removed?
Yeah, I mean, some of it was asked after the game. I know you asked about this, but I still can't really wrap my mind around the thought process of leaning into the strength of Michigan's defense and trying to run the ball the way that Ohio State was running in that game. So, like, I'm assuming the next time we talk to anybody, it'll just be Ryan Day. I don't know what the availabilities are going to be like pre-playoff games, and if they're going to force the coordinators to be available. So I don't know. We'll talk to Chip Kelly next and get his point of view on it, but certainly Ryan Day can speak for it. It just didn't make any sense. And I'm stating the obvious. I understand that. I think we really need to get to the heart of this fixation on feeling like Ohio State needs to run the ball or like to match Michigan's physicality, like leaning into the thing that Michigan does well. Granted, it's not like this is a typical Michigan team, but it's still a thing it does well because it doesn't throw the ball well. It's a thing it does best, I guess I should say. Why Ohio State went into that game thinking like they had to do the same thing when it has 3 Ferraris at receiver, and it was clear from not every single moment I tried to drop back to pass, but a lot of the moments where I tried to drop back and pass, that Michigan was going to have a hard time covering them. And it's not the first time we've had this conversation. I understand that, and that also is part of the problem. But like, whatever it is, whatever that mental block is, that is forcing Ohio State into a position where it feels like it needs to play this game on Michigan's terms has to change. I don't know that I feel that about every single game that Ohio State plays, but I definitely feel it about this one. And I think that is sort of the first step in turning this around, turning the rivalry around. And I think I understand why the thought exists, but now we're kind of 4 years into Ohio State trying to prove a point that I just don't think is built to prove. So why keep trying to do it when the ultimate objective should just be do whatever it takes to win the game? Like that is the part that remains baffling to me now, a couple days removed from the game.
The more I think about it, the more baffled I get as well, Bill, because if you want to follow down different lines of thinking and different strands, okay, the weather was bad. That was one explanation we got in the immediate aftermath of the game on Saturday. Michigan completed 3 third down throws through the air. Like 33% of their completions came in the second half or with the game in the balance, and they have nowhere near the firepower at quarterback or wide receiver that Ohio State does. So I don't know that I could fully buy into that one. You have a different path to go down, which is how banged up was Will Howard in that game.
Mm-hmm.
And that one gets tricky as well. I mean, maybe the impact starts to wear you down in the third or fourth quarter. You feel reluctant to rely on him as a passer, but he came out and immediately and notably made plays in the 2-minute drill. And when Ohio State was going tempo and pushing the football, they were undoubtedly at their best in that game. So did something change? Were you reticent because of the injury? And if you go down that path, that leads you down 15 different avenues as well. None of them are very positive, but every explanation for that, I immediately encounter difficulty coming to terms or accepting that the weather, or if Will Howard was strong enough to go out there and play, why they wouldn't be featuring the parts of their game that were best, because what they were doing was choosing to emphasize their weakness against Michigan's strength. And I am not an expert, but I don't think that's what you're supposed to do. It doesn't make any sense to approach it that way, but we're going to have to follow up on those things. And that's not going to be a fun conversation. And Ohio State doesn't like to talk about injuries. Will Howard was in a position where I don't know what else he could have actually said. The way that he phrased it on Saturday is, they cleared me and I was and I felt good enough to go play. Okay, then that puts the onus somewhere else. And again, that goes back to the coaching staff or the training staff. And if that's correct that the training staff cleared him, then you should be running your full offense. So you can talk yourself into circles and all this stuff, but at the end, it still comes back to if you didn't trust Will Howard to throw, then he shouldn't have been in the game. If you thought that the weather was impacting your offense, then why did you construct one that was built around, as you said, Ferraris or McLarens or Red Bulls at wide receiver? Everywhere you go says this is what you built to win the games that are the most important, and yet you don't treat one single opponent that way every single time you play them 4 years in a row. I really can't get over it. And I know that these are just questions, not answers, and we're never going to get answers about it, which is the most frustrating part.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't know. I actually haven't rewatched the game yet. I will to see if there was anything on the TV that would suggest that Will Howard wasn't quite himself. Like I'll admit that I was surprised he went back into the game, but we were watching from the press box, like the whole kind of protocol they went through to put him back onto the field seemed fairly thorough. And I don't know if watching it live from the box, I thought that there was anything off with him, and like the 2-minute drill looked fine. So like I maybe something got worse throughout the course of the game. I'm not sure. I don't think I watched Will Howard thinking he didn't look great. I don't think he played well, but I just think it could be that he just didn't play well. He was pressured a lot. I don't think he handled the pressure great. So there's a lot to unpack there. Like it's player health certainly is not something to toy around with. I think Ohio State went through the proper steps to ensure that Will Howard was okay to put back in the game, but that's definitely worth following up more on. But even
I'm not suggesting that they didn't.
I haven't seen a ton that people were saying that. But it was odd, I think, how quickly he went back into the game, maybe, but also he looked fine when he went back into the game. So I don't know. It's part of the puzzle. I think it was pretty clear even before that happened that their game plan was sort of out of whack. And they were intent on matching Michigan's rushing prowess or perceived rushing prowess with what they thought would be their own. And that wasn't particularly effective. And I do think we're like well past the point of trying to prove anything in this game other than Ohio State's ability to win it. So I don't know why it has to be done a certain way. Why it can't just be by leaning into the things that Ohio State does best. And like I'm regretting a little bit. Like I asked about the 12-man on the field penalty after the game because I thought that was also just like not the biggest, but one of the bigger coaching blunders I've seen. To have too many men on the field in that situation after a timeout. I'm regretting not pushing a little more on the wind stuff because I find that to be kind of a BS answer. It wasn't like gusting 40 miles an hour. They could have thrown the ball. So and it'll be odd to do that, days, if not a week or more after the fact, but I don't think it should go away because it's not like it's the first time it's happened in this particular game. So that's like the biggest thing I'm hung up on is like how could you possibly go into that game thinking that was the way you were going to win it?
Yeah, and to me, like the more that you sit there and look at it and you think about, for me, I'm thinking about Ohio State losing the game in 2022 and then the game plan that it came back with against Georgia, and it was like, maybe you won't be able to just run at this really talented front. Maybe the strength of your team is relying on your quarterback's accuracy and improvisation and really talented wide receivers. And like, it feels to me like one opponent is treated vastly different than everyone else. And we talked about, this has come up in other games, and Berm mentioned it Monday at Roosters, where it's like so many times, and this used to be primarily a defensive conversation. You used to line up, you don't feel like you have to be creative, and you have better athletes, and you're going to go win the game if you're Ohio State. And it has felt like they're starting to do that more frequently on offense, which the creativity just disappears specific to Michigan. Against Georgia, that wasn't the case once they got into the Peach Bowl. Here you go. Here's what Ohio State does best, and here's going to be a bunch of routes that are going to get guys open down the field and put stress on a secondary, and they're going to make a ton of plays, and they're going to rely on their quarterback. They hadn't done that in the game before that, and you don't have to treat Michigan like it is different than everyone else, especially a bad Michigan, which is, I think, why people are so frustrated. And I know I'm not covering any new ground for Ohio State fans that have also spent 3 days trying to rationalize or come to terms with what happened on Saturday. But whatever this mental hangup is with offensive game plans, you would hope that it's isolated just to Michigan, because if it's not, and then it becomes something that they do again in 3 weeks, let's say in the horseshoe against Tennessee, we'll find out later on Tuesday night what the likelihood of those matchups are going to be. Like, you know, I don't know how you come to terms with that ever. So hopefully they learn from that, but you shouldn't have to be looking for silver linings after losing the game because you pounded your head into a wall for the 4th straight year.
Yeah, I'm not looking for silver linings in this one.
I'm not saying you.
I know. Yeah. I know.
Generally,
I know you're not either. I don't think anybody is. No silver. No, thank you.
Yeah.
I guess. Yeah, there's probably not much more to say about that particular point. I do think this kind of goes hand in hand with it. Whether or not Ohio State can do what it needs to do with this offensive line moving forward. Was that just a really bad game with a bad game plan against a good defensive line, and specifically two very good defensive tackles who Ohio State just couldn't block for the entire game? Or was that, I don't know, emblematic of something that is going to rear its head again the next time Ohio State gets back on the field? Because there's a pretty good chance that whoever that opponent is, they're going to have a pretty good defensive line too. Maybe not as good of tackles as Michigan has, but still good defensive line. And like the interior, really nothing was good. You look at the PFF grades there; it looks like a car crash. It's bad. But the interior in particular was quite bad. We figured it would be a pretty stiff challenge for Ohio State's offensive line, and it turned out being far more difficult than I was anticipating. I think part of that is what they tried to do against that defense, but even some of the pressures that were given up, Will Howard I think was pressured on like half of his dropbacks, which was I think the highest it's been this year by far. Even in the Nebraska game where they didn't pass block particularly well, I don't think it was quite that high. So that brings into the question of like, it's okay, you're past the Michigan game, the season's not over, but are you actually positioned now to go on this postseason run that Will Howard was talking about after the game if your offensive line is this? So that's like the lingering sort of football matchup question coming out of that you can take moving forward. I don't know if like the psychological stuff and the mind games that come into play with facing Michigan actually apply to anything moving forward, provided Ohio State can just kind of get past it. But on the field, that offensive line looks like it's going to be a problem if they're going to play another team with a good defensive front.
I think it's an offshoot of the exact same conversation, because we made this point before the game, and we made it in other throughout the month of November, where it's like Chip Kelly was able to design schemes at UCLA with a lot less talent and still have one of the better, more productive offensive lines and rushing attacks and offenses in the nation. And Justin Fry has developed some of these other guys, and Austin Sareveld has stepped up and made plays. And, they handled different looks from Indiana and had success. And Donovan Jackson did enough to keep the offense largely on track against Penn State and really good defensive ends. I think it is all under the same umbrella of bizarre game planning or mismanagement. Because when they lined up and they're like, hey, check out this speed option, and it went for 15 yards, or you went misdirection on 4th and 1, Quinshon Judkins going around the end with Devin Brown in the game, that got 10 yards. Those two plays, 25 yards. Everything else, trying to run straight ahead between the tackles. At halftime, we were looking at those numbers, and at that point it was 5 more carries for 1 yard. There are enough other opportunities to scheme to the perimeter or throw to the perimeter or try counters, misdirection, things that we've seen Ohio State do previously that just frankly did not exist in this game. And, I don't think, and maybe that's too optimistic of an outlook. Michigan overwhelmed them up front, but I don't think Austin Sareveld, Carson Hensman, or Tegra Shabola were done all that many favors. Now, the draw with Travion Henderson on 3rd and long, it looked like it might actually get somewhere on the left side, but they missed. Tegra Shabola missed a key block. And so I'm not waving that off and saying this was all 100% game plan specific. but they didn't get the benefit of coaches putting them in position to make more plays throughout the duration of the game. It's not to say that you couldn't go nitpick one play or two plays or three plays for this person, that person, or that person where they didn't execute. Of course there are those, but they worked away around that against Penn State. They worked around it against Indiana, and I felt like they were trying to work straight through it against Michigan when clearly they were not going to be able to.
Yeah, no, there's a way. I mean, we talked about it even when Josh Simmons went down in the Oregon game. Like, what are the ways they're going to have to scheme around this a little bit? And there have been times where that's felt promising. I think you're dealt another blow by losing Seth McLaughlin, and obviously it gets that much more difficult. But they threw a couple of screens against Indiana. They got called back for penalties, but they tried them, and I think they threw one against Michigan, right?
And it worked.
And it worked. They were not trying to get the ball on the perimeter at all. Like, they chose to play Michigan in the phone booth, and Michigan's like, yeah, great. Well, we'll do that because that's kind of the only chance we have here to win this game. Thank you very much for leaning into our strengths and not making us account for our weaknesses. Great job, Ohio State. So I do think you're right. It's maybe the concern I'm stating about the offensive line might be a little hyperbolic because there should be ways to help them out via scheme that I think clearly did not happen against Michigan. Like, I know it's true, right? The players have to go out there. They're the ones who are making the plays, but you got to give them a good plan, and they did not give them a good plan. So I guess I don't mean to be like doom and gloom about the offensive line moving forward, but I'm not going to sit here and lie and say like, oh, that was good. They just like misplay here, misplay there. I was like, no, they kind of got worked for the entire game. But maybe there's something different to land on there with that group that can just put them in better situations to be more successful. They were pretty good pass protection wise against Indiana. I think they were at least better pass protection wise against Michigan than they were run blocking. So there should be opportunities to attack horizontally. There should be opportunities to attack down the field. I honestly, I don't doubt much that Ohio State will come out of that game knowing that and thinking that it should do that, but that doesn't erase the missteps that happened on Saturday. Like, it's not good job. You figured out that wasn't a great game plan. It's too bad you didn't figure it out going into the Michigan game
or at halftime.
When
they had frankly, a pretty good, compelling argument to maybe continuing to go up tempo or throw the football or use Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka in the second half. Because I've said this every day since Saturday. At halftime, I thought the game was over because they were running the offense that I expected they would and needed to, and I didn't think Michigan was going to score again. And Michigan had no business scoring again after that. They certainly made a couple plays on the Ohio State defense late. We know that. You pointed out as well that they didn't force a punt in that situation in the fourth quarter again. So, but there's not going to be a moment where you catch me nitpicking or blaming the defense, I guess, for what happened on Saturday. This was a complete offensive meltdown and special teams issues rearing their head, which I guess I can't believe that this would be something that we're talking about in December, but I guess I would like to ask Ryan Day or somebody more specifically how involved they were with kickers in the transfer portal, because we know that they pursued one for sure and lost out to Alabama, but did they lose a bidding war? Did they think they were totally okay with Jaden Fielding? Like, this sounds like a silly thing to bring up, and maybe there will be no good of talking about it because Jaden Fielding is going to be their kicker in the playoff. And so maybe they won't answer that at all, but I guess we never really broached that topic again, or maybe you did at one point in the off season, but this is another thing when you're talking about roster management and transfer portal and NIL that they could have addressed and chose not to.
Yeah. I think I would like to know like the roster building strategy as it applies to special teams for sure. Cause I think you'd say the same thing about punter. Their punter can't punt it more than 40 yards. And they have this big kid from Australia who they don't want to put out there because he might kick it over the stadium sideways. So like, I understand that, but to not prioritize that at all in a season where you're saying how much you're emphasizing special teams and how much more of a priority it is to you is a little odd. I said this with Doug, I think on Sunday. like for all the different ways you could skin this and try to come out the Ohio State loss to Michigan, you could also just simply say Michigan went into the transfer portal and got a really good field goal kicker, and Ohio State didn't. And that Michigan's kicker kicked 2 field goals and Ohio State's kicker missed 2. So I know the guy that they were in on for Miami, Ohio, that went to Alabama, I think he's only kicked like 9 field goals this year. That's the other part about it for Ohio State, is like they don't kick a lot of field goals, but almost all of them are like fairly high leverage when they happen. So like what monetary value do you ascribe to that when the guy's only going to be on the field in important moments 11 times a year or whatever it might end up being? Like I guess I understand from that standpoint why it wouldn't be front of mind, but then you get into a game like this, and it shouldn't have been in that position in the first place, obviously, but it did come down to it, to whether or not you can make a couple of field goals, and Jaden Fielding couldn't do it. And Ohio State really hasn't had a plan at kicker for much of Ryan Day's tenure. It's felt like they've kind of just sort of backed into whatever was available. They brought in Noah Ruggles, and he was good until he was fine until he wasn't. They brought in a kid from USC who I don't even think got on the field at Ohio State, right? Jake Seibert kicked as a freshman and then never kicked again anywhere, I don't think. Maybe he kicked a little bit at Northern Illinois. So it's been a very odd journey at kicker. It just seems like such an obvious thing to make sure it doesn't fall by the wayside, but clearly it wasn't front of mind for Ohio State, or else they would have been more aggressive trying to go find one in the offseason.
So it kind of buried this lead. I mentioned it off the top. We don't know exactly what the press conference schedule is as of this moment. Historically and traditionally, Ohio State's coach appears on the signing day, the start of the early signing period, which would be Wednesday. We are, I don't know, hopeful, optimistic that is going to happen for Ohio State. I think that it should, because for several reasons. Sure. A, they're going to sign a bunch of really good players, and Ohio State should talk about that, or Ryan Day should talk about that. And B, they would do better to analyze and move on from Saturday and get some of these questions out of the way, so that C, on Selection Sunday, they're not overwhelmed by continuing to break down the game and focus on the negative aspects when they're going to theoretically be trying to move forward and rally the fan base to likely be selling tickets into the Horseshoe. Again, we'll find out if that's actually the case, but we say this a lot. And I know that sometimes people get annoyed by, not everyone, but some people get annoyed by the inside baseball and when is the media availability. I think by and large, everyone would like to get answers from Ryan Day right now. And I think that ripping the Band-Aid, in this case, ripping it off, would do a world of good for Ohio State and for Ryan Day, even if it's incredibly painful, which ripping Band-Aids off is. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to do it at some point, and I think that Wednesday should be that, and I hope that in that way common sense prevails.
Yeah, I mean, the questions are going to get asked either way. Do you want to hear them on Wednesday, or do you want to hear them on Sunday, or do you want to hear them next Wednesday? You're not going to avoid them. I guess you can choose to not answer them, but they're going to get asked, so you might as well do it as fast as possible.
Yeah. Again, that's what the Band-Aid ripping is for. Kickers and offensive line. We are a predictable bunch here.
Yeah. I mean, there's whenever this is, I guess I'd be surprised that if there's not something on Wednesday. What the tenor is of that, I think will be interesting. Because it actually wasn't. It probably could have been and should have been ratcheted up a little more on Sunday. Not that like the media shows up for a fist fight in a press conference necessarily, but I think that Ryan Day probably should have been asked some different and more pressing questions after the game than what he was. I include myself in that.
Yeah, like what?
I just think doubling down more on what the game plan was. Like the word playoff should not have been uttered. I think it was asked in a couple of questions.
Right.
So that's one thing. I think it's mostly just the game plan stuff. I think he I don't know. He gets paid a lot of money to be the steward of Ohio State football. I think he owes an explanation to the millions of Ohio State fans about why he's the right guy to keep doing that, because the results I don't think bear it out. So it's always a tricky question. Like, why do you think you're the right person to keep leading this program forward? But I do think something along those lines needs to be asked of him, because the results are what they are. And I know what his record is. Like people, and I know people like Ryan Day. His record is very good. It's not about that. It's not like you don't get paid $10 million a year to beat Purdue. You get paid to beat Michigan and to win championships, and he's not doing it.
Yeah. And a day like Wednesday could theoretically be a good time for him to say, well, these are the players that I signed. They're very good. Now, again, I certainly understand the skepticism about Ryan Day and the fans who, or anyone who decides that they want Ryan Day out. So, well, you had all this talent already and you didn't beat Michigan and win championships. I absolutely, I already know and am aware of what the counter argument to that is. But, that would be, at least from Ryan Day's perspective, if he's trying to continue to sell himself in the program at the same time, talking about Devin Sanchez and Riley Pettijohn or anybody else in this class would be a great opportunity for him to say they're coming here because of the program that I, Ryan Day, have built and this coaching staff. And if you'd like that to continue, I feel like I'm the person for that. Like that would be, if I was making that decision about when to schedule the press conference, Wednesday would probably be the ideal opportunity for him to focus on the future for that. And that doesn't mean that it would undermine the counter arguments against him in any way. And I'm not suggesting that they would, for the people that strongly feel that way or that Ohio State has to move on. But that is a compelling case for him.
No, it is. It is. Yeah. And I don't know. I guess on some level that can be seen as like using the shield of a good recruiting class, but that's part of the job too. It's part of the job too. And like within that, there's still questions. It's like your defensive line class kind of fell apart again, and your offensive line class is not what people expected it to be. Right. But there are plenty of bright spots in the class too. Like I get that. Like it's not, and I think it seemed like there was a concerted effort by members of that class on Twitter on Sunday and Monday to like remind people that like we still believe in this program and we still believe in Ryan Day, which is the kind of endorsement you want to see from the people that are ultimately going to be the ones who decide where this program goes on the field. So it would line up for that to be like a nice time for him to make that. I don't even know what you call it, proclamation or whatever, but plea. Yeah. So if he doesn't, and if he again, like now we're being like PR managers, it would be a heck of a wasted opportunity if they don't, I guess.
Well, it sounds like some things that I said last December. So we'll see if that, if I have to repeat myself and become a broken record on that front again. I hope that I don't. I don't enjoy saying it any more than anyone likes hearing me say it. So we'll see if that does become the case. We'll be waiting to see what is scheduled by Ohio State. We will be back with the podcast daily, no matter what, for Wednesday. There's no stocks. No, it's not going to happen.
No.
We'll get ready for the early signing period.
Trading is closed.
Yeah, the windows are closed. We'll have Berm. Well, I mean, blue chip stocks with recruits. Maybe Berm can get into that and talk about the future. So we'll preview what's coming on that front and see what else we have as this week rolls along. We'll also find out on Tuesday night where Ohio State slides in the College Football Playoff Selection Committee and what that means. So we'll continue to break all that down and talk about the Buckeyes every day on the podcast daily. Thanks for joining us on a Tuesday version, a hypothetical Talking Tuesday, which is everyone's favorite. He's Bill Landis. I'm Austin Ward. We'll see you later.